What historical fact you find insane is not commonly known? Story 1. A very recent historical fact that is weirdly not talked about as much as it should be. Microsoft had accumulated such a big monopoly over the personal computer market through the 80s and 90s that in 1997, Microsoft was nearly broken apart by the US government. In an attempt to avoid an investigation, Microsoft invested nearly $150 million into a then failing Apple computer to give the US government less ammunition in a potential antitrust case. This saved Apple from bankruptcy and helped them to become one of the biggest tech companies in history. Microsoft, however, profited off of this investment. In 2003, Microsoft sold their shares in Apple for nearly $600 million. Story 2. Portugal had a death queen, and it is an insane real love story. If you like Romeo and Juliet, search for the story of Dom Pedro and Dona Inês for the real-life version of it. Long story short, Dom Pedro was first in line to be the next king of Portugal. So his father, the king, arranged a marriage suited for his position with a Spanish noble lady. The future king fell in love with one of the ladies in waiting of his bride, Dona Inês. They got married in secret and had a bunch of kids. The king didn't like that and sent his knights to kill her. Dom Pedro went crazy, found the knights and killed them, and ripped off the heart of one of the knights. Then he got the corpse of Dona Inês, put it on the throne, and made the nobles pay allegiance to her by kissing her hand. He still became king in the end. There's a lot more to this story, but all of it is crazy, but true. Portuguese royals' history is full of stuff that could be part of Game of Thrones. Story 3. For Americans, the Coal Wars were a series of armed conflicts from the 1890s to the 1930s, in which the exploitation of mining workers led to riots and then outright battles between the workers and the armed mercenaries hired by mining companies to terrorize and kill them. It culminated in the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, which ended when the United States Army was deployed on domestic soil to eliminate the strikers. And then our nation collectively held it, because we wouldn't want other exploited workers to get ideas. Story 4. When there are talks about colonization, the countries that always come to mind are England, Spain, and France. It's pretty weird for me that most people forget the Netherlands and Portugal, as they both had very impactful colonies around the world. I could understand if the case was that people would refer first to the oldest ones, but if that was the case, the Portuguese colonies should be referred to as well, as they go as far back as the 1500s. It's wild to me about how history has sort of just glossed over how impactful the Portuguese were in shipbuilding or innovation and sea exploration in general. The Dutch were by far and large the worst aggressors in the slave trade. The fact that the Dutch army was massacring entire villages in Africa well into the late 1940s seems to go unnoticed as well. Apparently, the wooden shoes and windmills are a better selling point than the genocide of literally millions of Africans. Story 5. The late Queen of England had two mentally disabled cousins who were abandoned in a mental hospital, which was literally once called the Asylum for Idiots, and never claimed as part of the family. And they were even listed as dead for 47 and 26 years, respectively, before the truth came. George V was euthanized against his will because they thought it was more dignified to have his death reported in the morning news than the evening. In medieval Germany, it was common for priests and nuns to literally enter symbolic marriages to Jesus, and numerous religious books from the era mention the wedding night. There was a species of tortoise on the Galapagos that was never fully cataloged at the time of Darwin's expedition because it was so delicious, no specimens made it back to the UK. Story 6. James Marshall did not discover gold at Sutter's Mill in California, which would start the gold rush. Peter Weimer, a kid playing at the site where the mill was being built, found the gold. The family of the kid kept the gold and had James Marshall confirm what they found. He told the family to boil water and drop the gold inside a pot to clean it. It was gold. Before James showed up, the Mormons building the mill, known to be excellent carpenters, knew what the kid found. It was said they left the mill to go back to their community to begin searching for gold. Another fun. Peter ended up fighting for the Confederacy during the Civil War. I'll see if I can find the journal I read this from. This story was told secondhand, and Peter fighting for the Confederacy is from my research. Story 7. In Australia. Between the 1950s and 1975, there were an estimated 250,000 forced adoptions, taking children from unwed mothers. They were forced or coerced to give away their children. Some were drugged and others told that their children had died shortly after birth. There could be many more because often records weren't kept of these adoptions and birth certificates were forged to name adoptive parents as birth parents. I know for a fact that the practice continued well into the 80s in some hospitals because I was almost taken off my mother. But instead of signing the adoption paper, she just took me and left the hospital. She then spent the next 2 years fighting to legally keep me. Story 8. The Aztecs were taking daily baths and engineered sophisticated aqueducts that brought fresh water for drinking and bathing. They collected poop and urine and recycled them. They had cities built on water. Meanwhile, in Europe, They were powdering their faces and throwing crap in the street. The Aztec Empire lasted from 1325 to 1520. So any comparisons I'm making to Europe are from that time period. Azteca people were advanced in many ways, especially when it came to hygiene. Their infrastructure was planned out to support efficient waterways for bringing clean water to households and crops. Azteca were hell-bent on hygiene and were at the forefront of dentistry. Europeans even took a bit from their book, specifically speaking about hygiene. The Aztec culture had a big focus on also teaching children proper hygiene practices. They were advanced people with advanced engineering skills, medicinal practices, astronomers, and more. And yes, the Aztec people made blood sacrifices to their sun god, Huitzilopochtli, in the masses. This is their infamy. I don't feel the need to keep writing how brutal it was. We know they had piles. Story 9. There is very little original material in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament if you prefer. It's mostly much older myths associated with gods like Enki, retold and attributed to the Hebrew god. The Great Flood is an example of a myth that long predates Hebrew culture. It includes sections of the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, practically word for word, and instead attributes it to divine inspiration of the Hebrew god. There was no mention of any kind of devil figure until the young religion came into contact with Zoroastrianism, which introduced the concept of duality. Most people's perception of the Hebrew Bible is very similar to people's perception of Elvis. Elvis didn't write those songs, invent that style of music. He just made it famous. Our culture as a whole completely ignores all the shoulders that Elvis was standing on, which included mostly black artists who are all but forgotten now. And when people say the Bible is the divinely inspired word of God, they forget that even if that's true, it's the divinely inspired word of a few dozen other gods that then had Yahweh pasted across the front of them for the version we got. Story 10. The huge head turbans worn by people of the Moroccan Sahara and the sultans of the Ottoman Empire are a reminder of death, as it is a very long piece of fabric that is supposed to be used to wrap the body of the person who is wearing it if they died. So currying such a piece on the head that is supposed to be used for after the death of the person is a reminder of how short our lives and that they should take care of their communities and people surrounding them to leave a good deed. Also, it is a reminder of bravery, as the person who wears it knows that they might die any time, so they should be brave in defending their community. Story 11. Around the turn of the 1900s, a banana corporation then known as the United Fruit Corporation, now known as Chiquita, from whom you may still be buying bananas, once bribed government officials in Honduras and Guatemala to sell them vast tracts of land on which to grow their bananas on the cheap. New incoming administrations, aware of this corruption, promised voters that they'd tackle this corruption and take those lands back through eminent domain, a process that is basically the government forces you to sell it land at a fair price, which is used for things like making highways. And these administrations won their elections and began to do just that. Chiquita, not wanting to lose their land, convinced the U.S. government that these were socialist plots, and that because domino theory was prevalent at the time, if they didn't stop communism would spread to the Americas and overthrow the U.S. In response, the U.S. government instituted coups in both these countries, overthrew their democratically elected government, and instituted right-wing puppet dictatorships that tethered these countries' economies to that of the U.S. and this banana corporation, This drove these countries into the ground until they fell into civil war to get rid of these tyrannical dictatorships. And this is where we get the term Banana Republic from O. And this last June, the same company was convicted in Florida of funding terrorist paramilitary groups in Colombia to commit war crimes, including homicides, kidnappings, torture, and forced disappearances. So, they didn't really stop. Story 12. Prohibition worked. The decade that it was, in effect, transformed America for the better in ways that are still felt today. Domestic abuse and alcohol deaths plummeted, and yes, even crime rates fell. The rise in organized crime people talk about was partially unrelated and not representative of all crime during that period. They ticked up after it ended, but stayed below pre-prohibition rate. Even today, alcoholism in the U.S. is lower than in the U.K., largely because the culture of drinking has permanently changed. The propaganda about how prohibiting things always backfires is not just not true, but we only believe it because that was a political justification for ending prohibition when really some people just like beer. And the deep crisis that led to its enactment had ended, thanks to prohibition. It was a real throw away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not currently getting wet situation. Story 13. Most of you probably know this, but I still find it very fun. During the siege of Constantinople by the Ottomans, the Byzantines put a chain over the entrance to the Golden Horn. I think that's the name of the gulf there, so that the Ottoman ships could not get inside. However, the guys were very determined to do this, so they somehow managed to roll the ships over land and still get inside the Gulf. My professor said to me that they oiled them on the belly and rolled them with logs or to encircle the chain. Story 14. The Republican Party in America started as an anti-slavery Democratic Party, got Lincoln elected, ended slavery through a war, then transitioned into the Winners' Party. By the start of the 20th century, it faced a split between anti and pro-big business, which is what caused Teddy Roosevelt to leave it and enabled Wilson, a Democrat, to win just before World War I. After it, Republicans were exclusively a big business, low regulation party through the 1920s, leading to the Great Depression. After World War II, when they ran Eisenhower, he had to be asked what party he was a member of, as he believed military figures should not espouse political views. Nixon is really the beginning of the modern Republican Party, and he embraced racism and fear as a party platform. Once that combined with religious zealots in the 1980s, we got what we have today. Racism, fear of foreigners, acquiescence to big business, and fringe religious beliefs as a political platform. Story 15, another intriguing yet not widely known historical fact is the story of the Great Emu War in Australia. In 1932, Australia faced an unexpected enemy, emus. After World War I, many Australian veterans were given land in Western Australia to farm, but they struggled with pests, including a massive influx of emus that migrated inland during breeding season. The emus devastated crops, so the government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to cull the emu population. Despite their efforts, the emus proved surprisingly resilient, and the war ended with minimal reduction in their numbers. This bizarre military operation is often cited as a rare case of humans losing a war against wildlife. Story 16. In March 1932, veterans from World War I marched on Washington to demand the bonus pay they'd been promised. Hoover sent the army to attack the protesters, led by some guys you've heard of. On July 28, 1932, General Douglas MacArthur led the U.S. Army and police in an attack on the Bonus Army in Washington, D.C. The Bonus Army was made up of World War I veterans who had come to the Capitol to demand early payment of their promised wartime bonuses. President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to evict the marchers after the Senate defeated a bill to pay the bonuses. MacArthur's troops included 600 soldiers, some on horseback, and 6 light tanks, along with his aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Tank Commander Major George S. Patton. The troops used tanks, bayonets, tear gas, and cavalry to drive the marchers back across the Anacostia River and burn their main camp. The skirmish left 2 marchers dead and 3 police officers injured. In his official report, MacArthur praised his men for their discipline and avoiding civilian casualties. The Bonus Army dispersed by July 30th, but the event was a political blow to Hoover. Story 17. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine was being signaled by an American fleet to surface by low-powered depth charges. This is actually standard procedure if you are unable to establish other comms with the submarine. The sub had been out of contact with Moscow, thus the crew had no way of knowing if war had already broken out, and with the mounting pressure, failed air conditioning, and low batteries, the captain wanted to fire a nuclear-tipped torpedo at the U.S. fleet. This would have been very bad for the world, like nuclear Armageddon bad. Luckily, the XO of the ship, Vasily Arkhipov, was able to persuade the captain to surface and seek confirmation from Moscow, essentially preventing the very possible nuclear annihilation of the human race. Story 18. From 1977 to 1983, North Korea kidnapped ordinary Japanese citizens in Japan and brought them back to North Korea. The idea was to use them to teach North Korean spies how to blend in with Japanese society. In the case of the more elderly that were abducted, the idea was for North Korean spies to take their identities. The Japanese government has identified 17 individuals who went missing during this period. The North Korean government admitted they took 13 of the 17 lists and returned 5 alive. Some, the North Korean government claimed, had perished while in North Korea, but had their remains lost. Others, whose remains were returned to Japan, have been highly disputed as the remains of those abducted. It's a rather chilling but fascinating piece of history. Story 19. On March 8, 1967, International Women's Day, the Soviet Union tried to cause a nuclear war between China and the United States. The Soviets had been playing a cat-and-mouse game with subs. The Soviets were losing. China was becoming troublesome. The Soviets had a nuclear-armed sub that looked like current Chinese subs. They snuck up on Pearl Harbor and launched a missile at the naval base. The United States had advanced surveillance, so they knew it was a Soviet sub. They were confused as to what they were doing. The world didn't end that day because the United States had shared a 3-party verification tech with the Soviets. This was a KGB operation, and they didn't know about the 3-party tech. The missile just exploded on launch. Things like that happened dozens of times. For it being a Cold War, it was blazing hot every damn day. We are so lucky to be here. Story 20. During the closing months of World War II, a German officer, Major Josef Gangl, surrendered to American forces led by John C. Lee Jr. After surrendering, Gangl informed Lee of a group of French VIP POWs being held at Castle Itter. The guards had fled during the approach of the Americans, but the SS would most likely come to the castle to eradicate the Lee, his men Gangl, and his men all returned to Castle Itter, using their weaponry abandoned at the castle. Gangl, Lee, the combined German and American forces, and the French VIPs all held off the SS units until reinforcements arrived. Unfortunately, Gangl was killed whilst protecting one of the French VIPs. This battle, known as the Battle of Castle Itter, or Schloss Itter, later went on to inspire various books and the Sabaton song, The Last Battle, which is part of their 2016 album, The Last Stand. Itter Castle still stands to this day, still bearing some of the damage from the battle, though it is currently under private ownership and is not open to the public, tours, or visitors, despite some attempting to convince the current ownership to allow visitation due to the historical significance of the castle. Story 21. In 1982, the mayor of Key West, Dennis Warlow, being fed up with the U.S. basically treating the tiny island like a drug den and border patrol aides, using it as an impromptu border crossing to search for drugs, sarcastically declared war on the United States. He proclaimed the secession of the Conch Republic, island of Key West, from America by breaking a stale loaf of Cuban bread over the head of a man dressed as a sailor. Exactly 1 minute later, they surrendered to the U.S. and rejoined the Union, largely symbolic and a tongue-in-cheek form of protest against the Border Patrol agents' treatment of Key Westerners. It did enough to get the attention of state representatives and start the discussion which led to the eventual removal of the Border Patrol agent. Legend. Story 22. The Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI put a former pope on trial, Pope Formosus. This trial included a cross-examination of Pope Formosus and ended with him being pronounced guilty, excommunicated, his papacy declared null, and him being thrown into the Tiber. Why is this a crazy thing? Because Formosus was dead for 7 months when he was put on trial. The cross-examination included his answers being spoken by a priest appointed by Stephen. Even more oddly, the people sided with the corpse over the pope. When the body was officially washed up, it was collected and purported to perform miracles. Story 23. That General Motors, DuPont, and Exxon all knowingly poisoned every living thing for more than a century to profit from leaded gasoline's lower production costs. They are directly responsible for a significant reduction in the average IQ of human beings as a result of lead exposure, and it could easily be argued that they're indirectly responsible for all of the violence, oppression, evil, war, and genocide that has taken place since around 1923. The effects of lead exposure include reduced intellectual abilities and a marked increase in aggression and violent tendencies. It's not a stretch to say that things in Germany where exposure to engine exhaust was at higher concentrations than most of the world, from the 1920s to 1940s, could have turned out differently if everyone in the region was a little more intelligent and a little less angry and violent. Story 24. In 1966, when the U.S. needed grunts to fight the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara came up with a plan to lower the mental and physical requirements for draftees to be approved for service. There were upwards of 300,000 men recruited under the program, many of whom did not speak English, some of whom scored as low as the 10th percentile on the aptitude test, and others who had physical limitations that previously would have been 4F. These men died at 3 times the rate in Vietnam as those who were not in the group. There is no limit to what the American government is capable. Story 25. Sheep ruined a ton of land in the U.S. by eating native grasses and plants down to nothing, and making the land dry, devoid of nutrients or moisture, and a big chunk taken out of our biodiversity, often replaced by shallow-rooted, non-native grasses, completely different from the prairies that had been. They're also one of the main reasons the GoVT allowed and participated in all our wolves being killed and tried to exterminate all coyotes systematically too. It's not the sheep's fault, but damn, a lot of crap sucks because of them coming to the U.S. Story 26. Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne attended the 1936 Olympics in Berlin as the special guest of Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe. Lindbergh was so impressed by the German military prowess and the quality of its bombers, as well as the great spirit of the German populace under the Germans, that he eventually joined the executive board of the American First Committee, which campaigned for America to not intervene in the war in Europe. He also gave speeches and wrote articles that were heavily racist and notably pro-German. His reputation was heavily tarnished by this position, and once Pearl Harbor shattered America's political divisions, he was viewed as a traitor by many Americans. Story 27. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation that originated within the U.S. Department of Defense of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for CIA operatives to both stage and commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets, blame them on the Cuban government, and use them to justify a war against Cuba. The possibilities detailed in the document included the remote control of civilian aircraft which would be secretly repainted as U.S. Air Force planes, a fabricated shoot-down of a U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft off the coast of Cuba, the possible assassination of Cuban immigrants, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating terrorism in U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by President John F. Kennedy,